Marieke, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope that you're ready for these questions. I love interviewing you, and I know that you've got so many valuable things to share with our audience, either CPOs working with CEOs or CEOs actually trying to understand how to work with their CPO better and listen to some of those coaching aspects and working on culture and driving change. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you as well. And I hope I will be able to answer them too, but I'm looking forward to it, Emma. So yes, let me know what you want to know.
Let's jump in.
Yes.
So my first question, I got a few today. How do you perceive the evolving role of the CPO or CHRO in high growth environments? And what do you think the specific challenges are when managing people and CEOs through growth and change?
Big question, and indeed you're getting straight in there. So thank you, Emma. I think what I've observed as from my experiences, as you just spoke about, especially in the high growth area, is that strategic role of a CEO CPO relationship becomes even more important. Usually, when the business is going steady and it's pretty much the same or low growth, the expansion of what you need from a capability of your people, or just the mere volume of people that you need, but also the risk that you have with your people, is not the same, because there's not much change with that team over time. So what I've seen in some of the roles, and you've recruited me for one of them, thank you very much, is that there is a much bigger play from those CEOs to say, I know what the risk is if I don't manage this space well from a strategic perspective, but also I know what the opportunity is when I do it extremely well. So that bond and relationship becomes very, very important. I think then what is critical in that is that as a CEO and CPO, while I do strongly believe in having some healthy conflict, that relationship, if you're thinking exactly the same, well, then are you really useful in that relationship? But at the same time, eventually agreeing on the path forward around people and having a similar voice to both your organization as well as to board as well as externally is also extremely helpful. So I think having that assessment up front with your CEO, CPO, as you take on an opportunity, is something I would definitely encourage everybody to look for. I think in terms of challenges, I think there is part of it, again, is around that space of, on the one hand, the growth and the opportunity. So that's around, having that culture of agility, but also just having the right volume and the right quality of your people, and staying on track with how that links with your business goals. For instance, you at times it's very tempting to recruit ahead all of the time. But at times you can't do that, because simply you have a cost to manage as well. And you don't want to be in a situation, as many companies find themselves in at the moment, where you recruit so far ahead that you have to end up laying off a lot of people as well. And that's not a healthy situation. So keeping a control of that as a CPO is critical. At the same time, while you work on that growth, I think in a high growth situation, you also have that balance you need to build in with making sure the foundations for that next stage are always set up and built, which is not always the exciting work. It can be a little bit boring at times, but it needs to be done, and you need to have the controls in place. So those are some of the challenges, and I'm sure we'll go deeper into that as we go, but some of the challenges that I see.
Absolutely. Yeah, maybe you should write a playbook.
I like it. Yes.
And what insights can you share about the culture and values necessary for successful growth as a CPO? And how can you influence leaders to foster and nurture those values within their organizations as you grow?
Yeah, I think for me, I'm quoting Simon Sinek here, but I would think about it starts with why, right? The perspective of values culture, in my point of view, it starts with a purpose. What do you want to achieve? What do you want to do? And I believe as a leader in as a CPO, but also as a general leader, our success is coming from that purpose and then bringing that into real action and an ability for everybody to contribute to that. I personally enjoy working for founder CEOs in many of my roles because they have that really strong connection with their purpose. And it often comes from a really deep personal story, which is exciting. And most founder CEO websites, you find that story, right? And like with Genesis Care, it was deeply personal. Our CEO had a personal experience with his father, and equally so, right? Stephen Marks had that perspective of, as a person coming from the US here, I want to be in touch with the food that we have there, and I love our food. And how do we bring this Mexican food and this Mexican flavor to a country that hasn't gotten a lot of experience with that yet? And how do I make it then healthy? And how do I change the way the world eats through healthy fast food and real food? So again, that story that they bring is often very critical before you even get into, okay, what does that then mean? I think then again, and it doesn't always need to be high growth, doesn't always need to be founder led, obviously, but just take on that founder perspective again. The real opportunity as a founder that you have is creating your own values. I think it's hard to say, what are the right values for a company, because I think the beauty is in defining that for yourself. But things that often do show up are things like innovation, right? Partnership, trust.
Yep.
Those are the obvious ones, right? Around that space of, psychological safety is obviously a word that comes up in that space a lot. How do you create that? Well, with innovation, partnership, trust, right? That space is critical to make sure that you come up with the new ideas that you need in a high growth environment where you're constantly walking on your toes, right? On that next stage. Are you ready for it? Am I personally as a CEO ready for it? Am I ready for it as a CPO? Okay, let's make sure we plan ahead. I think in the end, right, how do you foster and nurture those values, especially as you grow so quickly? I've learned a lot from my experience in P&G here. It's a company with almost 200,000 employees, and they're very strong in driving their culture throughout their organization, right? It feels the same. But we've also grown a lot through acquisition. And as you could hear, I was part of many of them. And the first job in that acquisition was often to share the purpose, values, and principles on which we operate together with the business conduct manual in a new environment. Have a discussion around that. What does that mean? But also share very concrete examples of what is tolerated, what's not tolerated, what's rewarded, what's not rewarded.
Yep.
So starting off with being very clear is critical. As an example, when I just joined Genesis Care, I joined an organization that, yes, had grown really rapidly, but still had a lot of people there who were there from the start, which was awesome, including a lot of the doctors. But also was rapidly bringing in people. And one of those people was me. And I felt that it took too long for me to actually hear a patient story in the office. Don't get me wrong, I was in clinic before I even started. And of course you hear patient stories there. But in the office, my perspective was the first thing we need to hear is about these patients. That's what we work for. We deliver better life outcomes. Let's hear these patient stories. So I think making those, learning from P&G and bringing that in, bringing the stories in, but also demonstrating those values in different ways is critical. And I think, yes, it doesn't just stay like that. You need to work really hard on that. And that's how I see it, Emma.
Absolutely. I think during the pandemic, one thing that really happened was people were losing connection to the frontline stories. And so being able to keep talking about that and making sure that people understand why they're actually going to work and bringing them back to their purpose all the time through conversations, whether it be performance conversations or things that are happening with the business, whatever conversations you're having, people need to understand the why.
Yes, and I think, the more you can make that concrete, the better, right? So in Genesis Care, spending time in clinic when you just start is what we do, right? In GYG, as you know very well, we had that week where we spent just actually rolling burritos, right? And I'll be honest, I wasn't necessarily very good at it. I did have a fantastic time with it. And I think that's such a great way to bring it back to why are we actually here, right? Because these offices can become bubbles in
Yeah,
itself,
absolutely.
without having that true connection that is usually the reason why people start in the first place, but it can get forgotten over time.
It can. And in your experience, what strategies or approaches have proven effective in establishing a solid partnership between P&C and the CEO in high growth environments?
I mean, CEOs are basically people as well, right? So I think what works with others, with friends, family, is not that different of what works with the CEO, which is, how do you build trust? One is having, that connection in your values and purpose, and that's where it starts, right? Knowing that, having a feeling as in, I know what to expect from this person, they're a good person, without falling into the trap of therefore only hiring people exactly like you, right? So that's that
Need
real
diversity.
Yeah, exactly. So I think the other thing there is to have, once you have established that your values are the same, how do you create that strong connection to demonstrating the belief in trust by having common goals, but then also delivering what is expected and communicating that clearly. I remember one of my old CPOs that I was reporting to said to me, she starts every meeting she has with her manager to remind him of, hey, remember, these are the things I'm doing for you. Even if they're not fun things, just want to remind you, right? I'm working on these things and I'm delivering these things for you. And when I started doing some of that work, when I remembered that and started doing some of that work with my CEOs, it really made a big difference to our relationship, because there are so many things going on. For us, sometimes it's logical to remember everything that we have discussed, but for them, it's sometimes not as easy, as we have the same at times with our team members and our employees. So having that open communication, but also understanding that they're also trying to stay on top of everything that they have on their mind is important. So those would be some of the things that I've been thinking about.
Absolutely. And so, bringing that into it, what do you think are the critical leadership capabilities that need to be developed in organizations experiencing growth or change?
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember sitting in 3 interviews at companies like Genesis Care, at P&G as well, where I was working in very high growing businesses at times as well, especially throughout Asia Pacific. But then also at GYG, and my realization became that a lot of people believe they want to work in a high growth environment, but they actually, when they know what it's really like, they don't always want that. Because it's not always easy, right? You need to have a sense of adaptability, be able to understand, have that connection to where that vision is going to go, and know, it's a bit tough right now. In HR, for example, sometimes these foundations are not great, and as a BP, you'll be working on some really exciting stuff, but then some of the stuff, if you've come from an organization that is usually better set up in a way, you won't have those things. Like as an example, in P&G, on some of the acquisitions I was working on, I did Excel on payroll on an Excel sheet. Many of my P&G colleagues wouldn't have had that experience because they were working in parts of the business that was much more settled. So are you willing to get out of your comfort zone, roll up your sleeves, and also in that, bring other people with you? And I think a lot of that is around having a strong growth mindset of understanding, while you might not master everything right now, or you might not enjoy everything right now in that part as well, those challenges are opportunities to get better, to learn, to experience things. And I've personally found that that's really helped my career. There was a lot of times where people are like, why the hell are you going to that job in the middle of nowhere in a factory, leading a team on the factory floor? I'm like, well, A, it's actually a great team, and B, I'm going to learn a lot more than I think I would if I would take another opportunity. So taking those opportunities as they come is the type of people I would usually be looking for in this environment. I think the other thing that's been coming up lately a lot, as I've been on some of the panels, was the perspective of empathy and emotional intelligence, especially as it comes to leading people in this current era and space. And there's a lot of evidence to show that empathetic leadership obviously creates better business results, create better employee retention. And there is at times, a bit of a challenge between this perspective of, okay, can you be high growth, high performance while being empathetic? And there's enough evidence that you can. But people sometimes feel it needs to be a choice. Yes. Which it doesn't. You can work on high growth. You can hold people accountable against their results, but also be empathetic around the environment that they're dealing with, or the things that they're dealing with, both at work and in their life.
Yeah.
And that's something, as I think CPO, but also a whole executive team and a whole organization is something to always continue to work on, and not always easy and straightforward.
Yeah, because when you're building those paths and roadways in a new environment, you need to be able to bring people on the journey, and you need to have empathy for that, don't you?
Absolutely. I think that's the part, right? Where if you don't have that specific empathy, you're going to lose a lot of people along the way, and then you're on your own.
Yeah.
And that's often a big role as a CPO, to also make the leader who has this big vision as usually ahead of everyone, because these are often smart people, right? They've gotten to where they are for a reason. They're usually ahead, right? And they're already at the finish line, and they're like, okay, your team is still warming up, right? Or maybe they're not even warming up. They didn't even realize it was supposed to race. So you need to come back there for a minute, so that you can pull people along. And equally so, as CPOs in our own teams, we sometimes don't do it well as well.
You gotta look after yourselves too. And how do you, what key considerations do you put in place, or best practices do you put in place when you're looking at that talent and attraction piece in those types of organizations?
Well, the exciting thing is what is different, right? Because, of course, there's a lot of similarities with other businesses. Like, of course, you need to have an engaging environment to work in. Of course, you can work on your employer brand, et cetera, et cetera. That's all the same. I think sometimes in high growth, what is exciting is for people to be part of the long-term growth, right? So having an opportunity to share in that growth, for instance, through the LTI program, can be a really specific way that people want to step in early. Now, that comes with high risk, right? The high risk, high reward, they say. Not everybody will be interested in that. The other thing is what I found is I sometimes assumed, because environments were high growth, that people would understand that obviously there's a lot of career opportunity, because this organization is expanding, and so your opportunities are continuing to grow.
Yeah,
I've learned a little bit the hard way that not for everybody that's immediately understandable, and they don't always immediately make that link, because they're thinking maybe on a shorter term, or might not see it, or maybe don't know that there are people like them successful in the company. There are a gazillion reasons. But I think therefore, especially in a high growth company, those discussions around career, I think, are even more important to help people envision what's not there yet and what can be in the future, right? So we immediately, for instance, at UIG, when we started doing those discussions on a more regular, intense basis, we saw an immediate result on our engagement scores, because people are like, hey, wait a minute, now I'm having that discussion, I understand what's possible. Well, that opportunity hasn't changed. That was always there, right? The career opportunities were there. I now more understand what that means for me. And you need to do that everywhere. But I think sometimes it's a little bit harder to imagine in the space where those opportunities are created on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, absolutely. I've always enjoyed working in environments like that, where you'd have those discussions and they'd be saying, the sky's the limit. Nothing's going to stop you if you put everything into it, and you do what you need to do, and valuable contribution, you can go anywhere. And I think some people need to hear that.
Yeah, exactly.
And so how do you ensure that the culture, or the organizational culture that propelled the company's growth, is preserved when expanding rapidly? This is the golden question, because I think, when you are growing so quickly, and you touched on it before, where you said the CEO can be at the finish line, and then there's teams that are left behind. They didn't even know that there was, they were supposed to be warming up for the race. How do you make sure that that culture is preserved and brought along?
Yeah, I think what I mentioned before, I think is critical here. I think the stories, telling the stories about, what happened in the past, so to say, but what got us here, but then also what's going to get us to that next stage. That is very critical in sharing your values. I remember at Genesis Care, when we did one of the acquisitions, we had a tour bus going around those new clinics it was really centered around the values and saying, okay, these are our values. You share your story. What does it mean for you? And what does it mean for our patients, right? And how can they see those values come to life? I also love that opportunity where we actually said, you know what, let's have a discussion. Are these truly our values? And what are we missing here? What are we good at? And what are some of the ones that should be focused on a little bit stronger? And having those conversations with employees to hold yourself accountable against what you're saying is critical. I love also what my friends who've worked at Amazon share me about their way of keeping their values alive, and obviously a company that's grown, without boundaries, so to say. Starting, of course, is very, very small, not even that long ago as well. And one of the things that they do is using their values in their everyday actions and language, right? So for instance, he'll say, hey, in the interest of being obsessed with customer obsessed, today I went to visit that person and this is how we came to the conclusion, right? So that real language incorporation, I really love what they're doing there. At P&G, we used to use the organizational performance model by Hannah, and basically saying, okay, what drives culture? It's a combination of factors, and let's assess yourself against that. So you look at how decisions get made, how you reward people, what structures you have in your organization, right? If you're saying, I'm nimble and fast, that's what we are agile, but then you have a super hierarchical structure that needs a lot of approvals. Your structure might not benefit from, even if you have fast decision making, might not benefit because it takes a whole long time to get to the top of that hierarchy. If everybody makes a fast decision, but you have 12 layers to get through, it still takes you a long time. But then also the information you share, right? Is there high trust in the organization? No, not really, because actually you're holding back a lot of critical information from your team, right? So, and then which type of people do you hire as well? I'm doing some work at the moment with a founder, CEO of a startup called Totium, and I'm giving her the opportunity to define those values so that we can then start hiring people that fit those values, right? That prerogative of a founder is, again, you should define your values. How fantastic. Let's now find some people that fit with that. So all those elements in the end together will help you continue your culture. And if you don't keep an eye on all of them, one can actually pull it away, right? As an example, I remember working in that factory that I was speaking about earlier. And we thought we had this culture of delivering on results and safety, and that was our thinking of what our culture was. But what we were rewarding was crisis management. So everybody that was solving a major crisis was getting an award. Fantastic, you saved the day. What ended up happening is it was quite extreme. We had a fire in the factory. Wow. Which could have been life-threatening for people, and unfortunately nobody got hurt. But we were rewarding crisis. We weren't rewarding people keeping track of what needed to get done day to day, even if it was a bit boring, so to say. So we really had to look at that full circle to make sure what we put in place was delivering against the culture that we're really trying to drive. So
So bringing it back into performance, do you, like, when you're telling those stories, so, you're bringing back to your why as well, or your purpose, how do you ensure that people actually hear them? Do you talk about it in meetings? Like, I'm talking about the practicalities here as well, or does CEO do an update each week? How do you think is a really good way to communicate them?
So as an example, when when I was leading people at Genesis Care, all my communication, the first line would always be about our patients, and then next probably about our people. So it was just consistent. What are we doing to deliver better life outcomes for our patients? That's what was driving all of us, but having that reminder in them, whatever the communication was, almost, of course, if there was evacuate the building, it's a different thing.
Yeah.
But, and to come back to my previous story, but otherwise it was always starting with that patient and what we're doing in that space. And, you know, it can come in many different ways, right? But that's one way to do it. The other is highlight your people. So we had at GYG, for instance, we had a daily get together with our organization at 9 a.m. For everybody, either be on the road or in an office, and everybody would call and Zoom in. And we would take the opportunity to introduce our new people. So creating that partnership, right? You're all part of this new team now. And then everybody in the organization would every quarter again have a turn. And I'm sure with the growth that they're having, it might become every half a year or every year at some point, would get a turn to reintroduce themselves as well. And we'd answer one question. And, you know, that could be something linked to our food. For instance, what's your favorite GYG hack? But also at times it was something that was linked to something that people wanted to do. For instance, they want to have better learning opportunities. So we said, what's your latest LinkedIn learning course? Sorry. Yep. So taking the opportunity to have that two-way traffic, I think, is important. You know, yes, the CEO can share the stories, but having all your team members share the stories is so much more powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do you, or what metrics and indicators do you track to measure the effectiveness of P&C initiatives and their impact on the business growth?
Well, this is a good one. I was actually thinking maybe I should write, there's books about this, or maybe there is space for another book on this topic.
Your playbook, I told you.
Okay, you'll get part of the profits then if that all comes to fruition. Yes. So, I mean, you have the obvious ones, right? Like the engagement scores and those, that is a big one that boards more and more want to hear about. I remember some years back, they were like, okay, yeah, sure. I had to really encourage the executive team to hear, for instance, all the stories from all the different countries in P&G. And I had a great leader who said, okay, we'll make that happen, and got her CEO to work on that. But nowadays, CEOs know that it's critical, and also boards know it's critical to know their engagement. So it's becoming more and more part of the everyday talk. But things like turnover and your performance metrics in terms of your own team, but also your organization is important. But also the success of your leadership development programs, your succession plans. So there's loads of HR metrics. I think where the critical translation is for HR leaders, that are not all business leaders from background, right? Some are, but not all, is making that translation. Yeah. Okay. What does this actually mean for business? And that's not always straightforward. I loved when I was a leader on the factory floor because my results were so straightforward. It was so easy. Right? Yeah. Well, it wasn't easy, but you get my point. It was like, am I having a good day or am I having a bad day? You know it when you step your foot into that factory floor and the results are straightforward and clear. With us people, it's not always that immediate in a result, right? If you do a great succession plan, in the end, you'll have a great CEO who's able to deliver fantastic results. But can you really attribute that only to you and having a succession plan? Of course not, right? Or you having a development plan for that person? No. So what I really encourage every CPO or starting CPO or every other HR manager to do is look at the research that's there. For instance, most engaged companies are 20% more productive versus the rest, right? So some of those tools you can use, some of those numbers you can use to make some estimates in your company to say, listen, this is what we can achieve if we add another 10 points to our engagement survey. Yeah. Equally so, you know, taking some of your averages around the cost of your people, but also the cost of your onboarding, and saying the other way around, hey, you know, if we need to replace that person, this is the cost that of what that looks like. That is important, right? Which could range anywhere from $5,000 for recruiting costs and onboarding costs to 200,000 if it's a high level executive. So those costs can be really, really high, and giving transparency about that helps bring your leaders and your board along.
Yeah, absolutely. Ties directly to engagement.
Yeah.
So when you're coaching a CEO, how do you help them develop a growth mindset and seize opportunities for that personal and professional development?
I think it's interesting because most CEOs I found have that growth mindset to start with, right? So I feel like they are usually more comfortable in that space of, you know what, I might know something, but what I don't know yet, I'll learn. But then again, right, there's also imposter syndrome in CEOs. I was listening to this podcast from Stephen Bartlett. I don't know if you've heard it yet, Diary of a CEO. It's great. I recommend it. And there was a segment around imposter syndrome. And they're like, yeah, in a high growth company, you basically are constantly dealing with imposter because you're constantly doing something that you didn't do the day before. So I think at times our role of CPOs is just being that coach in that listening ear, and sometimes just listening to your CEO and having time for them to speak about that in a very trusting environment really helps. If you feel there is more space to do more, or you haven't built up that trusting relationship yet, I think understanding that and saying, maybe I'm not the best person, but let me get some other help, working maybe with your chair of a REMCO to get that support for the CEO, or it's basically work with the CEO and recommend a coach. Those things can help as well. It doesn't always depend just on us. And really building a team around that CEO to be successful is what I enjoy doing.
Yeah.
And I'm also, while I'm talking about that, I think that was one of the things that I didn't do well in my first CPO assignment when I got into that first opportunity. I think I was really assuming that once you're at that executive level, you actually need to do it all by yourself. And that's far from the truth, right? There's so many people that are keen to help you, but also can help you. And building that team around you, like, you know, the athletes have, right? They have maybe a sports psychologist, they might have their physio, they have their coach. So having that team around you as an elite business person is one of the things I think we also need to make sure we do for ourselves too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Not just for the CEO, for yourself. I think even owning my own business, I've learned that the hard way over the years. You can't do everything yourself, and you're not the expert. Leverage other people's strengths.
It's hard to admit, but yes.
I know, right? Sometimes just like do it myself, it's so much easier. Yes. But it's not in the end.
It's not in the end. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
No. So last question, and then I'm going to let you off the hook. What strategies have you found effective in managing people and CEOs through change and growth? So maintaining that healthy equilibrium between long-term planning and addressing current demands.
I think the way I see, I don't know if you know the Bridges model of transition. I personally really like it because it basically says people don't usually fear the change itself. They fear that transition. It's like mobile phones, right? I would love to maybe one day have an Android, but I like the end product, but I can't really for the life of me think about, oh, that transition is going to be painful, photos get lost, and I'll forget it. So I don't want to do it. I'll just stay with Apple, basically. And that's, of course, what they've worked on really hard as well.
Absolutely, they have.
They work on that fear of transition really hard. So I think helping with some easy tools, and again, CEOs are just like us, right? Having opportunities for teams to work together on solutions really helps that phase of fear and transition. Giving space to discuss it and having open conversations around that in that trusting environment helps as well. Building people around the team and your organization to provide a different perspective, right? But then again, having focused on, like in Genesis Care, we did really cool. We'd get people out of their day jobs basically for a week, throw them in a room more or less, obviously all in line with work health and safety standards, but and said, okay, you go and solve this problem for us. It's a big problem and we need your help. And we'd often take some of the great people out of different teams, make it very diverse, which helps people to become part of that change over time, because they have a real part in designing that and creating that. And with the CEO, sometimes that change is what they're leading, so it makes it a little bit easier. But also sometimes it gets put upon them as well, right? With board and having a team between yourself, board, CEO, there really helps. And I think we're in an era where boards more and more listen to that voice of a CPO and really want to hear what's going on, what the real culture is that as a CEO and executive you're driving, but also what's the reality of the situation. So I think using those relationships in a positive way, of course, with in partnership with your CEO is critical.
Yep. Absolutely. So what we've heard today, really distilling this information, and like when I say it back to you, it's probably going to sound really basic, but it's communication, so transparent communication and consistency with that communication, bringing people back to not only their why and purpose on why they join the organization, but then connecting that with the organization's true purpose and direction, creating that pathway and not being afraid to challenge some of the norms or the way people did things before, and really bringing people along that journey while you're creating those new pathways in changing or growing businesses, and then setting clear agendas, clear parameters, basis of working as well. So those relationships in the beginning, understanding between the CPO and the CEO what your values are, how you're going to operate within those values, and then evolve with that as well, and making sure that you've got the right team around you as a CPO, but then you're helping the CEO create the right team around them as well. And obviously doing what you say you're going to do to create, to really build that trust and bring people along. Is that what I got?
Wow, well done, Emma.
Have I missed anything?
You've used your listening skills very well, very impressive. No, I think that's about right. I don't think you've missed much there. And I think it is all about, in the end, bringing it to life, being connected and making it happen through action. And that's where, that's what counts in the end, right? Your results, that's what counts.
Yeah, it's not just your voice, it's your actions that matter as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Marieke. Is there anything else that you want to add? Any other little pearl of wisdom before we go?
I think, just thank you for giving me the opportunity to join this podcast as well. I think it's great what you're doing. You've got some fantastic people. And as I was prepping for this session, obviously I took the chance to listen to some of the other podcasts that you have. So definitely think that's awesome. And I hope I lived up to the level of expertise that was shared in the other podcasts. So thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure. Always a pleasure. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.